All right, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Sugar and Spikes podcast. It's been a minute since I've recorded, and that's partially because I've been making big changes in the business and stuff. I've been doing a lot of other podcasts, so definitely haven't taken the time to do mine, which is unfortunate, and we may talk a bit about that with today's topic. Also, I know for a fact that some of you guys were kind of tired of listening to me ramble on just by myself, so I really wanted to pause and wait until we could get a guest, and we have the most requested guest back. Tammy's here.
Hi, everybody.
And she's coming in with a really, really good topic that I think isn't talked about a lot. Or just like used as one word and then...
It's kind of a buzzword these days.
Yeah, but not really understood. So, want to kind of open with that?
Yeah, so I thought we could talk today about boundaries. You can call it a limit, a boundary, whatever you want to call it. But it's about asserting yourself. It's about saying, like, this is where I'm drawing the line and not going past that and not letting other people violate that space. But I think a lot of times it's kind of misunderstood to be this really aggressive, selfish kind of activity. And I don't think that's really true. And you don't have to do it in a really aggressive or way that is super offensive to people.
Well, and I think a lot of times, like, especially given the current climate and everything with all these men being named for inappropriate activity and stuff, like, I feel like boundaries is just kind of just being tossed into this idea of like a physical state.
And it's not just that, right?
Yeah.
So it's like you can have emotional boundaries, physical boundaries, workplace boundaries, right? It doesn't always have to be physical. It's kind of just this way of saying, here's this definite space where my responsibility for things is, and then beyond that is your space, and I'm not going to go beyond and into your space, and you're not going to go beyond into mine. So that can work in physical and emotional kind of more non-tangible ways, I think.
Yeah, and I think, like, you brought up the whole workplace thing, and I think at least millennials and stuff get a lot of shit for having this idea of like work-life boundaries and like, I'm not going to check my email at this time or things like that. But like, do boundaries have to be super crystal clear and like, I've drawn the line and this is it? Or can they be more fluid and like, how often can you reassess your boundaries?
So I think you can reassess them anytime you feel like you need to, right? I think it's always easier to start with tighter boundaries and then kind of relax them as you see fit, rather than trying to do it in reverse. Because what generally happens, and what I've kind of seen with clients that I work with, is they come in with no boundaries, and then when they try to set boundaries, they get a lot of pushback from people. And when you start with nothing, when you try to establish that thing, people are like, well, this isn't what I'm used to. This isn't the norm. This isn't how I think about our relationship or our interactions. And so it becomes tougher at that time, and there can be more pushback. But if you start with tighter boundaries, like people know from the beginning, like, here's my line. I don't check email on weekends, for example. You know that is just something that somebody doesn't do. You can kind of work with that and make adjustments from the beginning, rather than being like, well, you used to check email all the time, but now you're telling me you're not going to. That kind of upsets the routine and state of things. And it's not that you can't do it. It's just a little bit more difficult at that point.
Yeah, I totally went through that at one of my jobs where, like, I was in this one job and I started off as an intern, and you want to make a really good impression and do all of the things, right? So I was just constantly available no matter what, pulling like ridiculous hours like for a work day and stuff. And then it was maybe like 4 or 5 months after I transitioned into a salary role where A, I realized it was unsustainable, and B, was just kind of over it at that point because it's hard to keep up all of that stuff.
Right.
And I started not checking my emails past 7, and I started not doing all these things, and then my boss thought that there was something wrong. You know, and just did not react well at all. And like, of course, at the time, like I didn't have the full skills or anything to say, well, I'm reestablishing my work boundaries, because that conversation's not going to go over well at all. But, you know, it was definitely something I had to navigate, and I think that it could have been done differently.
Sure. I mean, hindsight's 20/20, right? Like setting boundaries takes practice. It's like any other skill. We may not naturally be very good at it. A lot of us have never learned how to do this in our lives. And so just like any other skill set that you learn, you can learn how to set boundaries. But think about when you first learn how to do something. It's clunky. It feels awkward. You may overdo it. You may underdo it. And so it's this process of swinging maybe from one side to the other in terms of extremes and landing somewhere in the middle. But it's not surprising to me that the first time you tried it, it probably was a little bit of a struggle, and you're like, oh, that did not feel good.
Another thing that I've seen kind of discussed a bit, or have kind of experienced or noticed, is this idea of people using boundaries kind of as an excuse to not do things. I know, like, I've definitely seen some folks in the coaching world and stuff that have said, well, I have boundaries like with this, and I'm like, that's not necessarily a boundary. Like, you're saying you just don't want to, which is fine, but don't say it's my personal boundary. Like, just say, I don't want to do that. Like, can you speak to, like, the difference between, well, I don't want to versus a boundary?
Well, I mean, boundaries are this idea of like healthy self-care, right? If there's a reason, I kind of get the idea, like maybe you don't work with a particular kind of client, there may be a reason why you don't. It may be beyond the boundaries of your competence, right? It may be something you've never done before. If it's something that's maybe very risky, it may be that you just can't manage that level of risk. And it could be a boundary too, but it may be more of a conversation like, I don't work with XYZ and this is why. Rather than saying, well, it's just a boundary. Because that, to me, is like a little bit of a shortcut to say, I just don't, and I don't want to explain why.
Exactly. And that's kind of the way I've seen it tossed around. And I'm like, it feels lazy. Whereas, especially for like coaches or folks in entrepreneurial roles, or you know, in like the personal development world, where like that is your time to shine and show that you have this awareness and can speak to more things, and then get people thinking about it.
I think it's a really good opportunity for some modeling, right? So like, even if you're saying, I don't work with X type of client, for example, you can say, this is why I don't. And, you know, it doesn't have to be this melodramatic, like super assertive or aggressive thing. You can set a boundary with just a simple conversation. And you don't have to always say, I'm setting a boundary. Like, that's, I think sometimes this idea of, here's my line, but you don't have to necessarily like draw that line or say that you're doing it. It can just be a conversation. It can be gentle. It can be assertive, not aggressive.
It can also, I feel like it could be organic. Like, if boundaries start with self-awareness, right? Like, what I'm willing to do, what I'm not willing to do. And then once you know that, like, it could be as simple as saying, no, that's not for me. No, that doesn't fit right now with where I am. Okay, perfect.
Yeah. It's so, what I kind of hear you saying too is it's this way of saying no that doesn't have to just be like, nope. Right? Like, it's other ways of saying that's not for me, or I'm not going to cross that line. But like, it could be as simple as saying, you know, cross me off the list.
Exactly.
Like, it says the same thing in a different, more possibly more gentle way.
Yeah. And it can be no. Like, I remember when I was in grad school, we had to do this practice where someone would ask us questions, and the only thing we could say was no. And like, that was, did you guys do it too?
Yeah.
So awkward, right?
Super awkward, because all of your own stuff kind of comes up, right? And you feel guilty. You feel like you have to go into this long explanation.
Or apologize. Like, someone asked me, hey, will you come over and like walk my dog? And I was like, I just wanted to say, sorry, I can't, like, I have class, but it was no.
Right.
And you just feel like a bitch. Like, but that's also, it's as neutral and assertive as I think it could possibly be. You know, but we're we're so pressured into the societal expectation and norms of having to account for everything that it gets messy.
Yeah, and I think the apology piece is really big. Like usually I know for myself and a lot of clients that I work with, when they say no, they feel like they have to give a reason. So no, but here's all the reasons I can't, but I really want to, and I can't, but I really want to, and I can't. And maybe you don't really want to, but we have this idea that we have to kind of put that front out there. Like if it weren't for these extenuating circumstances that I just can't get out of, I would totally do it. And I think that once that exercise and just saying no and not going past kind of can break that cycle, and then you can decide how you want to go about it.
Yeah. And I feel like this kind of came up, or this idea for topic kind of came up when I was texting you about interacting with someone who was like consistently just like pushing or challenging my own boundaries. And like the thing is like holding the line in a clear way without explaining stuff away can be important, because this person kept like overtaking like everything I was saying,
Right.
and making it to where like essentially it came down to, it's just like it doesn't work.
Yeah.
You know, so, and it could have saved me like 40 minutes worth of conversation if I would have just said that in the beginning.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's hard to identify that our boundaries are being pushed. You know, like we might not see it as that. We might see it as in some other way, like, oh, they need me, or oh, they're just really trying to show me XYZ. If that makes any sense. That's a little bit ambiguous, but like it really could just be after some self-reflection or a conversation with someone that you trust. You can be like, oh yeah, I just feel like my space is being taken away, my power is being taken away, like I don't like that feeling. And that is kind of a sign that, oh, this might be a boundary conversation that I need to have.
So let's say someone's listening and they're realizing that someone's like pushing their boundaries and making it messy and uncomfortable. What would someone do to like assert themselves in a not as clunky way as my work example was? So something that's a bit more smooth, or basic steps.
Sure. So I think like once you've identified that, if you decide that you need to assert a personal boundary, that there's kind of 3 good things you need to ask yourself. Is right now the right time for this conversation? You can tackle that immediately, and that can be best. And sometimes it's not the right time.
Yeah.
You know? And so if you kind of have this doubt that you would be able to handle the situation in like a positive and constructive way, wait. There's nothing wrong with waiting.
Yeah.
It's okay. And then, are you speaking to the right person? Right? Like, if you have a grievance with someone, who are you going to address that with? You may speak to a confidant, you may speak to someone close to you to try and work it out, but you don't want to be gossiping, especially like in the workplace, about something that's happened. You don't want that on your plate. So go to someone you trust, work it out, and that kind of leads into my third point is, are you ready to use the right words, or like what do you want to say? Because it can be helpful to practice that first, right? Because a lot of times when we first lay down a boundary, it's going to feel selfish. You may feel guilty. You may feel embarrassed, right? And you want to do it anyway, right? So you can tell yourself you have the right to self-care. You have the right to this. This is, you know, the place where your responsibility basically has ended, and the other person has to take responsibility for their part of it. And it doesn't mean there's no overlap, but there's definite spot, you know, in an interpersonal relationship, there's times when things just aren't your job, right? And so it's okay to recognize that and be like, that's not my responsibility.
Yeah.
And then, so you don't want to let that anxiety prevent you from taking care of yourself. And one of the ways you can do that is to practice with somebody first. What do I want to say? It might be clunky. So then the person says, well, what if you tried it this way? And you kind of go back and forth, and then you kind of work out what you want to say.
And a lot of times, like, what I've noticed is when you're talking about boundaries or, like, having those more direct conversations, you're using words that you don't normally use. So just saying those words to somebody else, like, even if it's not the same style, or if someone, like, tosses a different way to go about it, but, like, it physically gets your mouth used to using those words, which, like, is a whole other layer, you know? So...
It, like I said, it's a skill. It takes practice.
Yeah.
The first time you do it, it's going to feel weird. And the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it.
Well, I feel like practicing with someone also kind of covers your ass. Like if we're talking about like a workplace thing, if you're practicing having that type of conversation, that person can't go back and spread gossip because then it's always like, well, I was trying to figure out like how to communicate in a better way, and here's what actually happened. So yeah, I think that it's helpful for in the moment, and it totally covers your ass. So it's not like you guys are at a bar bitching about somebody, you know?
Right, exactly. And so when you think about using the right words, right, you want to clearly identify what it is you're trying to say. The boundary is what you're trying to set, right? Like, I am not going to check my email past 7 if that's what you need to do. And then you want to have a personal understanding of why you need this, right? Like my work time was just bleeding over into my personal time. I felt like I wasn't getting the things I needed done in my personal life done. And that this is just a way for me to keep those things separate and to make sure I have enough time for both things, right? And then when you talk to the person about it, you want to be straightforward. Don't beat around the bush. Be straightforward. And you don't have to apologize. You don't have to give a long explanation. And you can use like a calm, kind of neutral tone, right? And then just go for it.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right. Let me know how you guys are asserting your boundaries. And subscribe, follow me on all the social media. I'm Des W Ms. MBA. And you can find all of the essential links at DesireeW.com. Talk to you guys later.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.